Within the game files of Resident Evil 4 Remake, something was discovered that fans had suspected for a long time. A cut prologue in which we would have stepped into the shoes of Ashley Graham. But who found these files? What is actually contained in the material? What is missing? What would this prologue have meant for the story? And most importantly, why was it ultimately removed? Let's talk about it. Hey, I'm Andy, welcome back to Rely on Horror. On December 31st, 2025, the YouTuber TheKempy released a video that gave us the first deep insight into a never-released prologue chapter centered around Ashley Graham. Even back when the first trailers were shown, there were scenes featuring Ashley that never appeared in the final game. TheKempy extracted the remaining data directly from the game files and reconstructed the playable flow and overall structure of the prologue as accurately as possible based on what was still present in the build. According to the remaining data, the prologue was internally referred to as Chapter 0. It would have shown Ashley sneaking through the forest toward the village long before Leon's arrival and eventually being hunted by Ganados. Interestingly, even the brief sacrifice of another young woman that we see in the very first cutscene of the final game seems to have originally been part of this prologue. Chapter 0 would not only have introduced the Ganados and their brutality earlier, but likely would have also provided additional context for Ashley's situation. It may have shed more light on how she ended up there, how she was captured, how she was transported to Spain, and how she ultimately managed to break free and move through the woods on her own. Unfortunately, the actual cutscenes were removed entirely and only rough level segments remain playable. However, there are still traces in the system files that hint what these scenes once contained, such as a Ganado slowly and menacingly walking down a forest path. Attempting to play the extracted cutscenes unfortunately causes the game to crash immediately, since the game tries to access data that no longer exists. Everything points to Ashley not using any weapons during this section, just like later in the final game, but instead relying purely on stealth and avoidance. Only toward the end of the prologue does it appear that a chase sequence would have taken place. This is supported by newly discovered animation data showing Ashley moving in a much more panicked and frantic way than we ever saw in the finished version of the game. Most of the level appears to be extremely dark, which is why TheKempy significantly increased the brightness during his reconstruction. He speculates that Ashley may have used her phone as a light source, and that theory actually makes a lot of sense. Later in the game, we find Ashley's broken flip phone inside the church. It is easy to imagine that near the end of the prologue she may have fallen, causing the phone to break. This brings us to the central question. Why was Chapter 0 created in the first place? And more importantly, why was it cut? Experiencing the opening moments of the story from Ashley's perspective would have created a much deeper emotional connection to her character. Instead of first meeting her as Leon, we would have shared her fear, her confusion, and her vulnerability. It would have helped us see Ashley not as a passive burden or merely a damsel in distress, but briefly as a protagonist in her own right from the very start of the game. It also would have amplified the feeling of helplessness, because unlike Leon, we would have had no weapons at all, just like later in the game. On top of that, it would have provided additional narrative clarity and placed Ashley much more firmly at the center of the story. So, why did Capcom remove it? The answer is actually quite simple. Pacing. In narrative terms, pacing defines the rhythm through which a game, book or film structures the rise, sustainment, and release of tension. Resident Evil 4 has always had a fast and dynamic structure, both in the original version and in the remake. Even so, in the remake, it already takes roughly 10 minutes, including cutscenes, before you encounter your first enemy, and about 15 minutes before you reach the village, where the game truly begins to escalate. If we assume that the prologue would have lasted around 20 minutes, we would be looking at roughly 30 to 35 minutes before reaching the village, and on the first playthrough, possibly even 45 minutes before the game really gets going. That may be perfectly acceptable for a first run, but my assumption is that Capcom was thinking heavily about replayability and even speedrunners. Many of the game's most important rewards are tied directly to strict time requirements. The Chicago Sweeper, for example, requires a rank A run on Veteran in under 7 hours. The Hand Cannon requires finishing Veteran in under 5.5 hours with an S rank. On top of that, there are other time-gated unlocks such as the Gas Mask, the Primal Knife, the Chicken Head and the Cat Ears. Making us repeat a 20-minute stealth section on every playthrough would likely have had the opposite effect and weakened our attachment to Ashley. Instead, it might have caused frustration and resentment, especially when compared to the pacing of the original game. This is of course not officially confirmed by Capcom, but the theory is very plausible if you ask me. Personally, I think there could have been a perfect compromise. After completing the prologue once, the game could have offered players the option to skip it without any penalty. That way the narrative experience would remain intact, while repetitive frustration during challenge runs could have been avoided. I also strongly doubt that it was removed because of budget reasons. It is well known that the Resident Evil 2 and the Resident Evil 3 remake did not receive budgets comparable to mainline entries. However, due to their success, this was no longer the case with the Resident Evil 4 remake. I do not believe that time constraints or funding were the issue here. Instead, it seems far more likely that Capcom conducted late-stage playtests in which testers repeatedly flagged the prologue as problematic. This would also explain why so much of it still exists in the final build, suggesting that it was removed relatively late in development. Resident Evil also has a long tradition of cut content anyway, and even entire cancelled versions. From Resident Evil 1.5, which was nearly 80% complete, to Resident Evil 3.5, which even had a trailer and featured a stalker known as the Hawkman and had an airship setting. So we can say the cut Ashley prologue in Resident Evil 4 Remake fits neatly into that tradition. The difference this time is that unlike many other removed concepts, Resident Evil Dash for example, it is very clear why this one was cut. For those who want to see the remaining material for themselves, I have linked TheKempy's detailed walkthrough of Chapter 0 in the description. And now of course I would love to hear your thoughts. Do you think it's a shame that the prologue was removed, or do you understand Capcom's decision? Would you have preferred a compromise like an optional skip? Let me know in the comments below. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe, and of course visit our website relyonhorror.com for more news, reviews and analysis about your favorite horror video games. Have a good one, and I'll see you in the next video.